It is the spring of 2020. The Warhammer 40k community has just been recovering from a series of disastrous balance missteps from the game's developers. Eldari, an ever-present scourge since the release of the game's 8th edition, has finally been nerfed a few months prior. And the half-year of Space Marine domination that culminated in a disastrous and incredibly boring mirror match in the grand finals of the Las Vegas Open, the game's single largest tournament, back in February of that year, had seen the faction subsequently receive massive balance reworks. To all involved, it seemed like the meta was healing, and the promise of new releases around the corner cultivated excitement for transformative change to the competitive scene. But very soon, in March of that year, the streets of the world grew quiet. Due to a global quarantine put in place, large group events had been canceled, closing down the main lifelines of competition for tabletop games such as Warhammer 40,000, and driving mainstream competition to a new digital frontier. And all that while, the endless churn of content release did not abate. New supplements, miniatures, and codexes continue to stem from Warhammer 40,000's parent company, Games Workshop, driving a rapidly evolving and wholly unique competitive format that never saw a physical tabletop. So this is the story of how the world's largest tabletop miniature game expanded into the digital space, fundamentally restructuring how its competitive community prepared for events, and developed what later became known as Warhammer 40k's Ghost Meta. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and let's talk for a moment about competitive Warhammer 40k. Warhammer 40k competition has traditionally been contained in a couple mediums. Local league or RTT, Rogue Trader Tournament play, meaning local competitive groups or clubs that either meet regularly to refine lists or tactics, or those aforementioned RTTs, which are 3-round, one-day tournaments that incentivize competition with prize support. These are then punctuated by larger regional or national events, either GT or grand tournament level events, which is typically between 20 and 60 players and runs 2 days over 5 rounds of competition, or majors or super majors that usually run 6 rounds and draw hundreds of players from the local area or even worldwide. These last events provide the greatest amount of prestige, and that prestige is the main draw, with larger events accruing a greater number of ITC points and contributing more heavily toward a player's worldwide ranking. The ITC, or Independent Tournament Circuit, is a global ranking system that's upkept by the tournament organizing company Frontline Gaming, and was the gold standard for player placement at the time. The winner of the ITC, the player with the most accrued points over their top placement in large events, often won a cash prize and was heralded as the best 40k player in the world for that particular season, which put the organization in a weird spot come March of 2020, since the world experienced a global pandemic, was forced to declare widespread quarantine, and all but outlawed large gatherings of people, including things like Warhammer 40k tournaments. In fact, in late March of that year, Frontline Gaming put a global hold on all event scores to discourage players from trying to disobey local ordinances and run tournaments anyway. This totally put a stop to the development of the 40k metagame for the time. With no large events or results to look at, the global competitive scene was totally stagnated, which turned most competitive players to a new medium, that being Tabletop Simulator. This handy-dandy piece of software was developed by Berserk Games and is essentially a highly moddable physics emulator. It designed specifically to incorporate the physical mechanics of board and tabletop games into a digital medium. At its most basic, players can upload game assets like cards and standee miniatures, and then manually reenact the mechanics of a board game on a simulated table. But at its most extreme, modders can import their own custom sculpted miniatures and assets into the game and script out complex game systems to automatically resolve within the software. Warhammer 40k has always had an avid community on Tabletop Simulator, utilizing custom miniatures or models imported from 40k video games, and Steam Workshop's vast existing library of imported or customized terrain features to build out impressive custom maps and missions on which to prosecute exciting narrative battles that would either be impractical or impossible to do in person. But the quarantine caused this community to absolutely explode, growing its largest community Discord server to 100,000 players practically overnight. and even at one point causing Berserk Games to reach out to the 40k community and implement specific quality of life features to improve play of miniature games on TTS. With that rise, also saw a massive rise in competitive online play. This video has been sponsored by Lighter Creative, one of the biggest supporters of the channel and one of my favorite sponsors. And in the past, Lighter Creative has been the producers of incredible quality gaming mats, including mats that have grids and deployment zones demarcated on them, as well as WTC compatible terrain. However, one of my other favorite things is chapter-proof 2025 terrain. We use it online for my event series, and that's what I typically play on when I go to tournaments. And now these two tastes can taste great together, because Lighter Creative is responsible for a new line of gorgeous-looking chapter-proof 2025 terrain sets. These babies are made out of high-quality, high-density board and include some absolutely gorgeous printed artwork. The sets come stock with a very cool semi-translucent base system. They do outline the edges of the terrain features so you can easily see where the ruins end. On top of that, unlike a ton of other MDF or board-based terrain systems, the Lighter Creative versions are not complex to put together. These new chapter-proof 2025 terrain features go together snugly and sturdily, but are only composed of 1, 2, or maybe 3 pieces. In this case, that allows you to either flip them back and forth, allowing for a single set to make all of the terrain layouts in the CA 2025 tournament packet without having to get additional pieces. I'm always impressed by Lighter Creative's terrain offerings, and this is no different, and it's nice to see them support more terrain formats than just WTC. So check out the links in the video description or scan the QR code on screen now to get access to yours, and big thanks to Lighter Creative for sponsoring the video. Let's get back to the content. Now, part of the narrative for the latter half of Warhammer 40k's 8th edition was a story arc called Psychic Awakening. While the life cycle of Warhammer editions is usually and most notably punctuated by codex releases, new books for each army that contain updated army rules and lore, these can often be modified by books called supplements. The Psychic Awakening arc was driven by a series of these supplements, describing a storm of psychic energy that washed over the galaxy, altering its fabric with a new tear in reality called the Cicatrix Maledictum.
Cicatrix Maledictum.
With each supplement book describing this event's effects on another set of factions within the universe. This meant that each supplement brought new and novel mechanics to a select group of armies, in some cases radically altering how those armies could be fielded. This series launched in October of 2019, with the Eldari-focused Phoenix Rising, smack in the middle of what the community had bitterly dubbed the Space Marine Winter. This was a dire period highlighted by successive releases of sequentially more powerful Space Marine chapter supplements that saw the competitive scene absolutely flooded by progressively stronger and stronger Space Marine builds from a variety of chapters. And I'm sure we'll talk about that period of time in a future video on this channel at some point. In the lore, Space Marines in Warhammer 40k are divided into chapters, independent households or groups of warriors modified by the same genetic stock, who hold unique and sometimes wildly divergent cultures and tactical doctrines. While they are represented in-game by a select few chapters, most of which are hailing from the first founding generation, in other words, predecessors on which subsequent chapters are based, this doesn't come close to representing the totality of diverse characteristics that can be embodied by lesser-known chapter organizations. For this reason, most editions of 40k have included a custom chapter mechanic, allowing players to modify their Space Marine subfaction with unique abilities to better synergize with their favorite units or their custom army's particular traits. But as we said before, in early 2020, the Space Marine faction received massive reworks to their core abilities, reducing the power of every possible Space Marine army build, and opening the metagame wide to the new mechanics being introduced in Psychic Awakening. One of those mechanics was the inclusion of new sets of custom subfaction abilities, and not just for Space Marines, for every single army in the game. Now, 8th edition 40k leaned extremely heavily into these mechanics. While Space Marines had their chapters, the deep background of the 40k universe opens the door for similar subfactions in all armies. This included in faction codexes things like different craft worlds for Eldari, splinter hive fleets for Tyranids, forge worlds for Adeptus Mechanicus, regiments for Astra Militarum, sept worlds for the Tau Empire, and cult creeds for Genestealer Cult, to name just a few of these mechanics. While many of the canonical vehicle examples are included in that codex, allowing your Tyranid army, for example, to choose whether it was spawned by the Kraken or Leviathan Hive Fleets, or a Tau Strike Force to identify whether it was drawn from the Nidros or Sasea Sept. These custom mechanics gave players greater control over the exact abilities they incorporated into their force. This allowed for much greater player expression. You could design your army to perform exactly how you imagined it to do so in your head, but also it introduced a new level of competitive min-maxing. So let's turn our eye back to March of 2020. The dominant Space Marine faction has just been nerfed, and players have begun experimenting with the plethora of new faction mechanics made available through Psychic Awakening, starting with the series' very first release, the enigmatic space elves of the Eldari. The Eldari super faction actually had a lot more entries in 8th edition than it does now, and in this case, Craftworld Eldar are the equivalent of what the Eldari Codex is in 10th edition. They had received massive nerfs coming out of the early portion of 8th edition. Over successive metagames, they'd broken the game several different times, including using a wildly overpowered double action mechanic from the Ynnari subfaction that I've actually previously discussed on this channel, and following that up by dominating the meta in 2018 to early 2019 with flyer spam builds, aircraft-focused archetypes that stacked multiple overlapping hit modifiers that made their planes virtually impossible for some armies to interact with in any way. However, given that those nerfs were now pushing a year in the rear view, Eldari were looking for a new update, and they would get one in a balance update document known as Chapter Approved, a regularly scheduled release that released in December of 2019, which included some massive changes to Eldari points values. Now, points are the basic mechanic from which Warhammer 40k armies are constructed. For most of the game's existence, players have built to a standard points limit of 2,000 for a normal-sized game, with the value of each model or unit determining how many points it counts towards that limit. This is the most common method of balance for the game, with overperforming units or factions receiving points increases to their cost, and underperforming units receiving decreases. So that being said, many of the iconic Eldari grab vehicles had been massively underrepresented for the majority of 8th edition, given the overwhelming popularity of their ground troops, jet bikers, or aircraft, depending on the previous format of the metagame. So once the December 2019 points update was published, since many of these vehicles had seen successive points decreases to try to incentivize their play over the more optimal jet biker or aircraft-focused armies, this made them much easier to include in an army in large numbers. This allowed players to field a massive number of light to medium vehicles, from nimble Vipers and Warwalkers that were individually incredibly cheap to heavier grav tanks like Fire Prisms. And now, without the danger of hyper-efficient Space Marine infantry weapons knocking them out of the sky, such compositions began to see real experimentation. That was compounded by the selection of custom Craftworld traits and abilities available to the army. This included Masterful Shots, which allowed all units in the army to ignore the benefit of cover. Now, cover in 8th edition was a static improvement to a unit's base armor save, based on its proximity to terrain. Most infantry models with any part of their base touching the terrain features base received +1 to the bonus, making it a fairly situational effect. However, larger units, such as monsters or vehicles, gained it in a way weirder and more interesting way. At the time, all they were required to do was touch a terrain feature with any part of their model, which potentially included their rear tread, for example, that wasn't in any way near the opponent. If you did so, that allowed them to make use of the obscuring effect of any terrain feature in front of them, as long as it obscured at least half of their miniature from the attacking unit, even if that terrain feature was inches away from them in the middle of the table. This made the ability to ignore cover fairly important when it came to cracking the heavy armor saves of opposing vehicles, such as the vehicle sported by other Eldari armies, making the simplest solution to an Eldari vehicle-focused metagame to also play an Eldari vehicle-focused build. Now, most custom subfactions also consisted of 2 overlapping abilities, and Eldari were no different. In this case, the efficient shooting granted by Masterful Shots was compounded by their second trait trait expert crafters. Potentially one of the most controversial effects ever printed by Games Workshop, because it's one they simply refuse not to print in successive editions. It's even reappeared several places in 10th edition closer to the time of recording. This effect was originally found within the Salamander Space Marine chapter, and was meant to benefit the squad heavy weapons and meltaguns that are favored by that army. In context, that makes total sense. The effect gives a single reroll to hit and wound to each unit in the army, meaning it has high value on units that have individually high value attacks. In that original context, that means that a unit of Space Marines sporting bolt guns and a single anti-tank weapon like a missile launcher or a meltagun could ensure that that heavy weapon converts its attack against an enemy vehicle or something similar by giving it a bunch of rerolls, but not really generating much benefit for the rest of the bolt guns in the unit. However, in the context of a different faction like Eldari, when applied to a unit with an extremely low but high impact attack volume, such as a Viper or a Warwalker, both platforms that boast only 2 weapons, this effect becomes insane, basically rerolling about 50% of the total number of attacks that they make. Now, for context, the value of rerolling a single high impact die in 40k is generally considered by the game to be 1 command point. This is a resource that at the time was generally limited to somewhere around 10 or 12 per player per game, and that is used to fuel their stratagems, powerful buffs for their army. Now, while you wouldn't necessarily go around spending command points to reroll individual attacks for your units, when it comes to high impact weapons you would certainly consider it. And for an Eldari army that's fielding 15 plus individual units, each of which could benefit from 2 rerolls per round, 1 to hit and 1 to wound. That meant that an army of that composition could generate the equivalent of somewhere around 180 command points worth of value over a 6-round game. So the community very quickly moved towards these MSU, or multiple small unit archetypes, using dozens of individual tiny units, each packing independently strong heavy weapons to maximize the efficiency of this reroll effect. Now, were this to be an in-person metagame, a build like this might be affected by hobby lag. Hobby lag is a commonly cited phenomenon when it comes to the flexibility of the tabletop gaming community to adapt to new rules changes or metagames. Essentially, since most large competitions require that models be fully constructed and painted to a base level, kits have to be sourced from retailers, shipped to homes, unboxed, assembled, painted, etc. So there's a significant period of time where a change in the metagame is largely theoretical. In this way, new releases of the time may not have been optimized or broken for several or weeks or even months after their release, as new army compositions slowly evolved over successive tournament events after a several-week waiting period for the players to assemble and paint their miniatures. However, with gameplay moving online, that restriction was entirely lifted. Players found themselves able to iterate on list composition multiple times in a single day. Rather than that process taking weeks using proxies or half-assembled miniatures, you could instantaneously slot new models in and out of your army. Immediately, armies composed of mass heavy weapon platforms, Vipers, and Falcon grav tanks began to take shape, with the most optimal balance of each being sussed out. Now, to be clear, this wasn't an Eldari-only effect. This was occurring in multiple factions at once, with bizarre and extravagant builds from factions like Chaos Space Marines, Adeptus Sororitas, and even Grey Knights being very quickly adapted, driving a vibrant metagame all the way through the May of that year, which then saw the release of the Engine War supplement. This supplement was one of the waning releases of the Psychic Awakening arc, coming third from the last in the series, and was focused primarily on the Adeptus Mechanicus, with a massive wave of new releases for that faction, including new jump infantry, the Taraxi, Cerberus cavalry units, and new aircraft, in addition to everyone's favorite mechanic, subfaction abilities. Seemingly having learned from their missteps with the previous release of the Eldari subfaction abilities, Engine War placed restrictions on how Adeptus Mechanicus were allowed to construct their custom Forge Worlds. In this case, players were forced to choose a character for their Forge World to embody, either expansionist, rad-saturated, or data horde, each of which granted a single primary ability and then could select one from a list of secondary abilities to combine with that primary ability. This allowed the design team to limit the possible combinations that you could construct to only a few, more accurately balancing the mechanic and preventing the most synergistic of overlapping complementary effects, into which they then decided to place the 2 most synergistic effects under a single single Forge World type. The Data Horde Forge World came stock with the Magna Bond Alloys ability, giving all vehicles in the detachment a 6+ roll to ignore damage. In 10th edition, this effect has been renamed to a Feel No Pain roll, but at the time in 8th edition, they didn't have universal terminology, so they just had to write the rule out every time. This improved the average survivability of vehicles in the army by somewhere around 15%. A pretty good ability, but not necessarily groundbreaking. However, one of the optional abilities tied to this effect was the Servo-Focused Augury's secondary ability. This gave all Cognis weapons, a special subtype of servitor-driven autonomous weapon system widely used by various Adeptus Mechanicus units, full hit rerolls when targeting units within half range. A massive improvement in accuracy, especially when considering that most applicable Cognis weapons boasted base weapon ranges between 36 and 48 inches, meaning the half-range requirement effectively covered about half of the entire board before that unit moved. And where was the most common place to find Cognis weapons in the faction? On fast vehicles such as Iron Strider Ballistari and the newly released aircraft units, all of which were affected by the other trait, Magna Bond Alloys. Those aircraft were a crucial piece in the puzzle as well. Despite their Renaissance helicopter appearance, they're actually significantly more durable than other examples of the class. Remember those Eldari planes I mentioned earlier that had dominated the game months prior? Likely due to the Adeptus Mechanicus equivalent's physically larger size, Archaeopters, their aircraft vehicles, boasted a higher toughness characteristic, making it significantly more resilient to many classes of light vehicle-mounted weapons, such as autocannons, and their chaff launchers reduced incoming damage by 1, forcing the opponent to rely on low-attack, high-volume heavy weapons to efficiently deal damage, rather than the higher-volume, lower-strength multi-damage weapons that are typically suited for anti-aircraft roles. And remember how Eldari could stack multiple hit bonuses on their planes to make them almost uninteractable by many other armies? Well, Adeptus Mechanicus could do that too, if they selected the Styges subfaction for their aircraft wing. An interesting quirk of 8th edition detachment mechanics was that instead of being applied to the entire army, each subfaction was applied to a specific detachment. Detachments in this edition were subsets of an army, each one of them containing a selection of unit slots that you unlock upon their inclusion. While abilities weren't necessarily synergistic between different subfactions, meaning that a character from one subfaction likely couldn't buff units from a second subfaction, you were still able to include multiple different subfaction detachments in your army without ruining your other faction rules. In this way, Adeptus Mechanicus could contain several different detachments, each of them containing a different subfaction ability in a single army at one time. This led to the rise of mixed Forge World lists, ones that used Magna Bond Alloys and servo-focused auguries together to buff batteries of backline ranged attackers, such as Scorpius Disintegrators, which also provided powerful indirect fire, in addition to having several Cognis keyworded weapons, which allow them to get hit rerolls thanks to the detachment ability, as well as Iron Strider Ballistari, who could take incredibly hard-hitting heavy weapons, move them incredibly quickly, and get them easily within half range to get those hit rerolls. That was backed up by Styges Forge World Archaeopter Fuselov bombers that used bombs and extremely high-volume heavy stubber fire to sweep away massed formations from almost anywhere on the battlefield. All this was backed up by Cerberus Raiders, which are fast skirmish cavalry. Cerberus Raiders aren't the most impressive unit on the face of their datasheet. However, their release in Engine War brought with it one of the most controversial stratagems of all of 8th edition, Tactica Obliqua. Charging in Warhammer 40k is done via its own separate phase towards the end of a player's turn. This allows units to enter combat with enemy, and something that they normally aren't allowed to do in other phases. This means that not only are melee armies required to enter combat specifically via charging, they are also forced to play out their entire turn before declaring any charges, so they have little room for error or to reposition their models if any charges are failed. And the Tactica Obliqua stratagem allowed Cerberus Raider units to move in response to being charged by an opponent, usually causing the charge to automatically fail via distance. It was even for some reason usable while the Cerberus Raider unit was already in melee, meaning that even succeeding the first charge on a Raider unit was no guarantee that the second would be successful. And if the Cerberus Raiders move away in response to a subsequent charge, all of those units don't get to fight since they're not engaged anymore. The stratagem single-handedly defeated melee opponents. Large squads of Cerberus Raiders would simply envelop enemy melee units and prevent them from moving forward during their movement phase, forcing them to charge to engage them, and simply moving away to cause the charge to automatically fail and force the unit declaring the charge to just sit there and do nothing. Since melee armies relied heavily on charge movement to be able to take table space and disrupt control of enemy objectives, this would not only prevent melee enemies from engaging the Mechanicum gun line, it would also prevent them from contesting them on score. Combined with the already existent threat of mass Eldari grav tanks, units with fly that at the time, due to the core rules of 8th edition, could simply leave combat and fire their weapons with impunity, an otherwise relatively rare ability in 8th edition, the game became instantly toxic to any build relying on melee engagement. And all that being said, very few ranged armies could outcompete the subfaction ability combinations wielded by those Eldari and Adeptus Mechanicus armies. So during this May to July period, as the quarantine continued and online competition heated up, this rapid iteration led to the development of a totally unique metagame played out exclusively online, and saw virtually every event finals towards the end of the edition playing out as Eldari facing off against Adeptus Mechanicus, formulating 40k's Ghost meta. While this relatively short period of a stagnant meta was ultimately disrupted by the summer 2020 release of 40k's 9th edition, which saw its own insane metagame being developed rapidly by the online community, the unknown quantity of this previous format caused its mistakes to actually be directly repeated by the design team, who reprinted every single one of the most powerful Adeptus Mechanicus combos from Engine War into their 9th edition codex, alongside massive statistical improvements to the army overall. While many of the army's original aircraft builds had been nerfed by core rules that prevented the same level of subfaction mixing that we saw in 8th edition, Tactica Obliqua and the Magnabond alloys plus servo-focused auguries combo returned in its entirety, and the game saw a brief period of total Mechanicum domination as one of the most powerful factions ever released in Warhammer 40k, before receiving massive nerfs and even requiring changes to the core rules to be brought back in line. That's a whole nother release I could make a separate video on. While the masterful shots and expert crafters abilities returned in a slightly different form in the 9th edition Eldari Codex, the much later release of that book and the shift in focus from jet bikes and vehicles that the army had in 8th edition to more elite infantry, fortunately didn't see the exact same builds returning once again. Eldari had to make their own unique blend of broken subfaction combinations in the 9th edition book. However, the quick iteration time that saw to the rapid solving of this metagame persisted. Online events have now become a staple, with many players getting their starts online experimenting with new armies before finally purchasing miniatures and moving to in-person competition. Most competitive teams either encourage or outright strictly mandate their players to do online playtesting, allowing powerful builds and counters to evolve outside of the traditional arena of weekend events. There is even a persistent but, in fairness, unsubstantiated rumor that Games Workshop playtest teams also use digital play to crunch on new units, leading to more iterations before release and overall balance of new releases. And the results are clear. While 8th edition saw insane power spikes and the early stages of 10th edition were an utter madhouse, deserving of another whole video, the state of balance in 40k at the time of recording is the best it's ever been in the game's lifespan, with unique builds from almost every faction in the game toppling grand tournaments and major level events in tabletop play around the world every single week. All that made possible by this evolution in digital play. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and big thanks to all of the archive websites I've used over the course of this video. That includes Lexicanum, which has saved a lot of important release date and content information about individual book releases, Wahapedia, which archives all of Warhammer 40k's rules through the editions, and blogs like Fayette212 and the Frontline Gaming blog for preserving a lot of this stuff, including balance updates and commentary. The official Warhammer websites don't preserve balance documents, and it is hard to find older codex material online, so those archives are absolutely crucial for making videos like this possible. And you know who else makes these possible? Everybody who supports me. Not only the people watching all the way to the end of the video, if you're here, I love you, but also everyone who supports me either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members you can join in the link down below the video, as well as Twitch subscribers who help out my ongoing live stream online play, or if you want to watch some Tabletop Simulator 40k, I play that most weekdays over at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.